Hi, everybody. Welcome back for another episode of the Warm Up Podcast. Today, I am here with Reid, and he is the founder of Nerdy About Nature. I am so excited to have you here to talk to you about just this platform you've been creating, the content that you're making. It is incredible. It's so fun. It's so engaging. I feel like I learned a ton just from following you, but I just have so many questions. So I would love for you to start off by introducing yourself and then what Nerdy About Nature is all about.
Really stoked to be here. I appreciate the kind words, and it's always great to hear that people are enjoying the stuff that I'm doing. So my name's Ross. Pronouns are he, him. I sort of just got into Nerdy About Nature just serendipitously. It started as a complete joke, just like I would go on nature walks and stuff with friends and just be totally rambling off about different trees and how cool they were, and it was just driving them nuts, and to a point when they're like, you just need to start an Instagram account so you have a channel for this to go to. So that's kind of the way it started, and that was just before COVID. I think I started in December prior to COVID. And then when COVID hit, so my main job is I'm an outdoor filmmaker, mostly documentary, ski, sports, action sports type stuff. And when COVID hit, we couldn't travel anywhere, didn't have any work. So I just had nothing to do but put energy into this kind of passion project. And then that coupled with a lot of interesting things happening in British Columbia at the time, especially pertaining to old growth. It's just kind of become the perfect little vessel for information at a time when people really need this type of information, because nothing that I'm saying is too radical for the most part. It's not anything that nobody's ever heard of before. It's just stuff that most of us learned in second or third grade. And then we go about our lives being molded and shaped by the societies we live in to find our own little niches that we never really think about it anymore. So I'm just trying to remind people and encourage that connection to the outdoor spaces and to the world, and try to get people to remember how intricately connected we all are to it. And I guess in that vein, the kind of overall mission with it is to just open up education and awareness to a wide variety of people in the hopes that we can all work to create a more inclusive, diverse, and equitable future where everybody is engaged in these conversations and has access to this knowledge and access to the ability to have their voice heard, because that's the type of world we should be living in all aspects of life. So.
Yeah, I love that. And I feel like it shines through with everything that you're sharing, everything that you do. You were just, I think over the weekend, you were just out kind of advocating with indigenous communities for salmon fishing.
Against salmon farms. Yeah, there are Atlantic salmon farms here in British Columbia, and they're really bad for wild salmon populations, and just a bad thing in general, especially the open net model that we're currently using. So trying to just engage with people on that.
Yeah, what was that like? I feel like this is a really great, it's a current thing that you just did. So I would love to just ask what that experience was like. Yeah, just being in community with everyone, trying to raise awareness and stand up.
It was really cool in that many of the other kind of things that I've been involved with, or especially the Fairy Creek stuff happening in British Columbia, is taking part on Pachidat and Dididat lands, traditional First Nations lands. So it's mostly involved with those communities. So it's Western communities being involved with Indigenous communities, kind of trying to take a stand against these kind of corporate capitalist structures that are basically just raping and pillaging the land. This one was really cool because it's that similar type of thing where you have local Indigenous nations here who are standing up from that. But there was also many other nations that came from throughout British Columbia, from the east side of Vancouver Island and the mainland, came over to stand in solidarity and to support their plight, trying to remove these fish farms. So there was a lot of exchange of song and dance and these really cool cultural things that we just don't see a lot of these days, especially in this kind of the broader colonial setting that we live in. Our government and the quote unquote powers that be have done a really good job of making all these decisions that happen regarding our natural lands and our waters and our forests and everything happen from the lens of Western science or Western civilization through the realm of progress, quote unquote. And it's really cool and really important to see the Indigenous nations reclaiming their sovereignty over these resources that they've stewarded since time immemorial. Really powerful.
Yeah, that just like rang a bell when you were talking about, a more equitable future where we're all like standing up and like, working towards the same things. I had to ask you about that
Mm,
because I had seen it on your stories. I was like, that must have been such a not even just rewarding, but fulfilling environment to be in, to see all of these communities coming together, these people from different
mm,
backgrounds, but they all have the same mission. And like even people within your community that
mm.
aren't, maybe members of the indigenous tribal communities, but they want to come and show
Yeah.
support and solidarity. Like that's a beautiful thing. And even having, an outlet where that's being portrayed and shown on social media, like having a platform that's like giving visibility to that is so important. Because like you said, like, we get in these bubbles or you only see certain things, but it's like, oh wait, these are the realities of like what
Mhm.
these communities are facing, and like that these are dangerous for like salmon fishing and all of this stuff that they've been doing for years and years and years and decades even. And, bringing awareness and like allowing people to see through into that and like seeing these communities come
Totally.
together is important, because I don't know that people would just see that out, it's not going to
Yeah.
be on the
Well, it
news
actually
most
was on
likely.
the news, but it was funny because I watched the news thing, but I mean, even
Amazing.
that was just came at it with such a Western bias to it. Um, I don't know. And relative
Yeah.
to like what you're saying about like salmon fishing, yes, salmon fishing has been going on for centuries, thousands of years. Like, but salmon farming, the act of
Mhm.
that is relatively new. Like, I think they've only been salmon farming in this part of the world for just over a decade, so not even that long, and already the effects are so drastic and so devastating. Yeah,
Devastating.
and then looking at forestry or any of the other things we're doing, like anything that quote Western civilization has been doing on Turtle Island has only been happening for maximum 100 years, like 150 years, 250 years, like you can kind of say, but like really we didn't start making an impact. And I say we, like the colloquial, like societal we, didn't really start making an
Yeah.
impact until post World War One and World War Two, especially with all the mechanization of technology and in all these aspects, whether it's fishing, agricultural, forestry, anything. Like we were always doing those things, but we never were able to make like these drastic changes on the landscape until we had that technology come post-war,
Yeah.
post-World War. So on the grand scheme of life on this planet, like these civilizations and these communities have been operating on these landscapes through ancestral lineages for millions of years, and in a short century we've
Hmm.
been able to completely unravel all of that through through a system of mass consumption and overconsumption. So to see that kind of stewardship or responsibility be kind of shifted back towards those indigenous nations who have historically always stewarded these lands is, yeah, it's inspiring and
Yes.
it's like really great to see, but it just is like the tip of the iceberg for all that really needs to be enacted. And the fact that it's just barely on the news
Thousand.
is a great thing. Sure that it's on the news, but like everybody needs to be exposed to this.
This should be a
Yeah.
huge topic of conversation at all times. Like even just seeing some of the more recent announcements, like us getting our, global warming and climate change updates of just like, hey, like we
Mm,
are we are edging towards like we cannot reverse these things, and like how heavy and devastating that is, and that most people don't even know that
mhm,
these like reports come out, or that like, we think it's just this thing that it's not that big of a deal. It's not in our
mhm.
lifetime. And it's like, it is. Like, if you look around, like, it is happening every single day. Like, we are seeing things that should have never happened. And, like these catastrophic earth events that are like, every few
And
months now. It's terrifying to think about. And that people can just kind of opt out of being worried about it. Um, and then I turn and I look at, pages like yours and like Phil Monson, things like that are just like raising awareness and just trying to bring perspective of like, hey, we should all be paying attention. And you're doing it with like fun and humor, but also it's like these are serious topics too. And it's such a great way, I feel like, to
yeah,
make it palatable, because I think it's hard for most of us to consume this kind of media or like know that this is our reality, but you're doing it in a way where it's like presentable and you can swallow it and say, okay, like I'm learning these things, and like now I can take it and like translate it into my everyday life without it feeling necessarily like, a boulder that like the world is
right.
going to end. Like, so I feel like you're doing such a great job of advocating in a way that people can actually, it like resonates, in a way that people can read it, enjoy it, follow it, and then like hopefully it
Yeah.
sticks and implements in
Thank
some
you.
way.
I appreciate it.
Um,
It's
yeah.
that's definitely
Yeah,
that's definitely been the goal of it,
absolutely.
and it's really great to hear people like you saying that type of thing. I mean, you know, like so much of it, like what you're saying, like basically we live in a society where it's not easy to talk about these things because it's not convenient to the status quo. Like us talking about climate change or how
Yes.
completely, am I allowed to swear on this podcast? So how completely
Yes.
fucked things are. Like, um,
Yes.
that doesn't help sell more product. That doesn't keep money kind of cycling and going on in this economic scheme that we all need to work in order to have prosperity and the
Yep.
American dream and yada yada, all that stuff we've been taught. I guess so. Like the society that we live in has evolved in a way where these conversations aren't available to the layperson to just have. Like you have to be specialized, you have to have a degree,
Hmm.
you have to have some sort of involvement in order to have an opinion. And at the reality is that you know, these are conversations that we all should have a right to be having. You know, our forests are something that
Yeah.
we are all affected by. Same with our waters, our fish, like all of these conversations. We shouldn't have to have a forestry degree or a background in ecology to be able to have these discussions. And that's where I've been really trying to just open up this dialogue and open up this information to everybody so that we can all have engagement in these conversations and work to create a world that betters all of us, you know, with every stakeholder involved at the table here.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I feel like you're just making this content, these
Right.
conversations accessible to everybody. And it's like this is the beauty of, like, people talk about social media being a blessing and a curse. Like, it can obviously be used as a really negative thing, but there's also this huge potential to educate and share information and create movement and inspiring people through just having accessibility to these
Yeah.
kinds of accounts, this kind of attention that's being put on these kinds of topics. I think it's really important, and like this is the positive side of social media, is like having people that are utilizing it to just better
Yeah.
equip people to make decisions, to vote, to educate themselves, to get involved locally.
It
All of
is.
it,
It
it's so
is, but it's
important.
it's difficult, you know, and that's the thing where like the algorithms and the way that it's like it's more
Oh yeah.
rewarding and easier to talk about the Johnny Depp Andrea Heard trial or who Will Smith punched in the face. It's like who
Yeah, yeah,
gives a
yeah.
shit about any of that when like our waters are being polluted, our forests are being cut down, we're facing global warming, and all this stuff is happening under the radar because people are making
Yes.
money off us listening and paying attention to these ridiculously mundane topics of like news conversations and news articles that are coming out. Like, who cares? Who decided that Johnny Depp is news again? Like, I don't care about his private life. Why is that all over my
Hmm.
feed? The algorithm says
Hmm.
people likes that, and it just makes it easier for them to blast it out to more people so that they don't talk about real things. But so and so like
It's
with
so
everything
true.
that I've been doing with this and the whole kind of I guess like ethos behind it is really trying to just yes spread that awareness and allow people to have these conversations that they historically haven't been able to partake in, but then also really try to consciously and constructively work with people with opposing views to get people to work together here, because at the end of the day, you know, you might have
Hmm.
different views politically, ecologically, economically, whatever it may be from your neighbor. But at the end of the day, you all still shop at the same grocery store. And the only way any of us are going to get through this is by working together. So it's a matter of like having to kind of swallow your pride and have difficult conversations with people who have opinions that you might not necessarily agree with, but being able to give them the time and space to hear them out and then come at it from a constructive way, not just like getting defensive or trying to throw facts at them that they don't understand or name calling or any of that kind of shallow operating systems that we've been doing, like the way that we just go back to monkey brain on the internet and
Yeah.
start trolling people and send messages in all caps. Like none of that is constructive and it's never going to fix anything. So if we can just like work together.
Yeah. It feels like, yeah, it feels like we like become enemies when really we should be like, we're all humans. We all have like an aim at some point. Like we may have different reasons of like trying to get there, but we all have like this focus of wanting to survive and like take care of our families or whatever that is. Like whatever like reaches you, we all have that thing. And it's like, how can we like just sit together
Mhm.
and like talk to one another instead of like bringing out our
Right.
our weapons towards each other, because it's like, man, like somewhere in there we have something in common. Like we do have something where we're going towards
Mhm.
something that's similar in some way. Whether it's like, for me, it's like I want to take care of the planet, but like someone wants to like have financial security, but like there's something in there somewhere that like we could potentially connect
Yeah.
on if we tried.
Well, and you can have
That you
one
would hope.
without the other. Like that's another thing that I think um, our society has kind of done a disservice to all of us in doing, is just like isolating everything and making it so soloed or siloed. Sorry. So you think that like,
Yeah.
if you went into financial planning and that's your background, that's all you can discuss, and therefore you don't have an opinion on
Yeah.
something completely irrelevant to that. But like nothing exists in a silo. Like if you look at like finances, for example,
Yeah.
like what makes a stable investment? Something that is always showing increasing profit or return. Ideally, a higher rate of return is like a better investment because you're going to make more over the long term. But like,
Mhm.
how is that business or entity operating in a way that makes this investment or that makes this return? Well, it's probably coming from some sort of expense that's not calculated, whether it be ecologically, environmentally, socially. Like the idea of human rights is still an issue that is relatively recent in the Western world. But like, think about like where Tesla batteries are made. Like,
Yeah.
okay, it's a great deal because you can get a Tesla,
Yep.
but like that battery was mined by an 8-year-old in Democratic Republic of Congo to get the cobalt for that. Like, is that ethical? Like, that's a cost that has been sunk and you're not
Yeah.
taking into account. So it's like, you can't say that that's like a good investment because it has a high ROI, because all of a sudden it has all these other subconscious costs tied to it. So how do we get to a point when we can have
Yeah.
conversations about everything, have these nuances of conversation without having to be specialized and think that things only exist in this box? And if you care about fish, then you don't care about forests, or you don't care about the person's job down the street, because they are
Yeah.
all connected.
Yeah. We all are. And I think that that's the mission of it all, is to like remind people that we all are connected and the environment's connected. Our planet is connected. We are literally linked to everything. And yeah, like what you said, even about, like materials, like these precious resources, these materials that we use to
Mm-hmm.
make our phones, to make our computers, to make, everything that we have that are luxury that makes the world go round. Like they all have a cost. Like we're
Mm-hmm.
mining them and all of these things all over the world, all over the planet, where we can't get things necessarily in the US, but like this all has a side effect. Everything that we do has a
Whether or not
toll
it's
and a
calculated.
consequence, like
Yeah.
no matter what it is. Yeah, yeah. And it's just one of those things too where, even whenever I think about food and like people, consume, and they don't really have to think about where that chicken is, or like what happened to get those eggs, or anything like that. It's like
Mm-hmm.
there's just a convenience there where you just don't have to think about anything. And that's the same with our resources and our materials too. It's like, oh yeah, I have this table and I don't really
Mm-hmm.
have to think about where IKEA gets their lumber or anything like that. It's just like, well, there's more
Mm-hmm.
to every one of these stories, and I feel like it's just taking the time to even be mindful, or like to seek out that that's
Yeah,
that's something that we should consider,
totally.
I think is a big step too, because most
Yeah,
people
I
just
mean, we're
don't.
creatures of convenience. It's like you said, it's just easy to do the
Hmm.
easiest thing, and you have a table, and that serves its need, and you don't have to think about where it came from or where it goes after you're done with it, because it's just here now. It's a very myopic way
Yep.
of thinking, and that doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. Like I understand that like a lot of these conversations and constructs are much more difficult than like a lot of people care to think about, and that's fine. The reality is that we just need to
Yeah.
still work to create a world where there is no bad, where you don't have to think about whether or not that IKEA table is bad, because it just is good, because the way that the systems are set up, where it is, you know, I
Right.
don't know if that makes any sense. Because then as soon as you get into that, and well, this is where I kind of
Yes.
like, I don't know. I feel like I open up cans of worms in my head here, because like if you were to ask me, like I don't even know how strongly I believe in like the free market, or the way of things kind of
Mm.
correcting themselves, because I think the reason things like IKEA or Walmart or wherever it is are so cheap and affordable is because there's just a higher amount of cost that they haven't accounted for in that bottom line dollar that you spend. So it's
Mm.
like, if theoretically we were to be living in a world where every negative cost or externality is considered, I don't even think there would even be a difference in price between the highest the highest item thing on the menu and the lowest, because all of a sudden the lowest thing would have to account for all the negative things it's done to be bad or to just exist in the first place. So that $5 McDonald's burger is actually worth like $45 if you take into account all of the negative externalities of like what it does to the water supply, the nutrient cycle, labor issues all along the line. Versus like a $20 burger at a fancy restaurant that still has its associated like negative things like that come with it. So it's like, I don't know, really capitalism is just about like, how do you make a buck or make more profit off something than the next guy? And that comes down to reducing costs, and reducing costs, the easiest way to do that is to just not include the cost in something. So yeah.
I feel like once you start thinking about all of the complexities and like start getting into the subjects, and it's like these deeper levels of subjects, it's like there is like, how do you even resolve some of these things? Like, where do we even start? Like, how do you make moves in the right direction? You know, because it can be a really overwhelming thing. And I feel like that's probably where a lot of people in society end up, where they're just like, well, yeah, I care. But like, what do I even do? I don't even know where to start. I'm getting this information. I feel overwhelmed and I want to do something, but like everything's wrong. So like, where do I start? Because it seems like there's issues left and right in every possible way. So what is your take on that? Like, where does someone start? Probably with education.
Education's huge. I mean, what I always tell people, because I get this question a lot too. I mean, we live in a world where it can be really easy to feel defeated or useless, or that you don't really have a way to make an impactful, lasting change. But at the end of the day, we all live in these systems that are theoretically democracies or free markets. So it's like you have choice, and that's in how you vote, how you speak your mind, how you like raise awareness to the issues you care about, which then theoretically and then that theoretically dictates the changes that come down through policy levels in the society we live, theoretically. Now, of course, this is like, this is a gray area, and there's a lot of horror stories about interconnections and ties and people working to lobby against that. And like, that is really can be defeating for sure. But I feel like we have to still approach it with that constructive mentality, because if we give up, then nothing really changes. And then we just let the 1% at the top win. In reality, we need to start to form a society that treats everybody equally, regardless of the race, religion, color, creed, where they come from on the social ladder, as well as everything. So that means that like all the trees, birds, plants, other species besides us, like we've for far too long been operating on this planet from like a very anthropocentric perspective, and we need to recognize that we are just one species of like, what is it, like 7.8 billion species on the planet? We don't even know. We've only cataloged like maybe 20% of all the species on this planet existing today. So like, we are one of those species, and we all interact with one another in like this crazy interconnected web that is so far beyond our comprehension. Maybe the best way forward is just exercise a little bit of humility and recognize that fucking Johnny Depp and Andrea Heard don't really matter. We don't matter. Like, that table that you're sitting at right now doesn't really matter in the long run. Like, we need to start thinking about this in a much more broader, holistic level that encompasses everyone and everything for a better future for all of us.
I'm clapping. So if anybody, I'm just like, yes, preach. It's so true though. Like we need to take a step back and remember that, like, we always see these things about like we're a speck on this planet, but we really are. There's so much more than just us, or like me out here operating. Like everything is bigger than myself. And it is my job to keep that in mind, to like advocate for things that can't advocate for themselves. Like, we have done a lot of damage. That goes back to what we originally talked about in the beginning, like just from, consuming and just like taking instead of like giving back and paying attention to the fact that like this planet we're getting so many resources, so many things from this planet without ever like instilling back into it. This needs to be a reciprocal cycle. But
operating with reciprocity. I love that. And it sounds really hokey to say as like a white settler guy here on stolen indigenous land, but like I think that a good step forward for all of us through all aspects of society on Turtle Island and throughout the world, to kind of rectify this or find like a better way of doing things, not rectify necessarily, but like just create like a better system, is to pay attention to learn from and to empower indigenous nations wherever you live, and become naturalized within those settings. Like my family heritage is from Norway, England, and Denmark. You know, my mom immigrated to Canada from Denmark when she was 4 years old, and I have that whole background, and like we do all the Danish traditions, and it's like, it's cool, it's great, whatever, but we don't live in Denmark. So on these lands, like I don't go out here trying to just like tear down these western red cedars and hemlocks and try to plant like native things that would have been growing in Denmark, nor do I try to implement that kind of Danish way of life or that culture on these lands, because it's a different part of the world. And just like when you travel to any different part of the world, you don't go to Mexico and not learn how to say like hola, like, you know, not know how to say a couple words of Spanish, yet we're over here in these parts of the world trying to like impart our Western culture and society on these nations, on these lands, as if it's the best thing out there. And we can look to at least 150 years of some pretty detailed history to see that that is not the case, that there's actually a much better and different way of doing things, but we have to learn to let go of our attachments to these systems that has been just so drilled into us through all these years of, I don't know, brainwashing, you could call it, but just like this like arrogant kind of like nationalist mentality of like, America's the best, Canada's the best. Like, yeah.
This is the way. Yeah. This is the only way. Yeah. Yep. And there are other, systems or ways of doing things that are better than the way that we've been doing things. And that, I guess that's just like humbling ourselves too, to say like, maybe we got it wrong. Maybe we didn't do things right. And we should be learning from other cultures and communities and backgrounds that potentially have been doing it in ways that, we ignored. And now we need to like instill these and like make things right, quote unquote, like, I think there is a level of humbleness and humility there that for us to say like, yeah, we did a disservice and now we have to course correct and start to like give these communities seats at the table, because really we shouldn't be leading the table potentially, like we're not the masters and we're not the people that have the knowledge, and we should be allowing people to come and sit at the table and share and teach us, because we're not the all-knowing, and we have been doing more harm than good in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to environmental policies and protection and stuff.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think it's just that, just kind of general Western arrogance to think that we know all and know better and know the best. Like even science, like there's a lot to be said about like looking to science for the answers, and science being the thing that we should all be following, which I agree with. Yes, we should be following science, certainly more than religion in like many of our decisions, especially when it comes to, I don't know, human rights and body rights and whether or not someone has, we don't need to get into abortion stuff, but it's insane,
just like,
right?
like just rights for existing. For everyone.
But having said that, it's important to recognize that science is also changing based on the technology and things that we have at the time. So, 30 years ago, using forests as an example, there wasn't a ton of science suggesting the sort of interconnectivity between all these different species and these ecosystems as we currently know now. So the practices were laid out in a way that didn't really regard those, which, okay, so there was a little bit like we didn't fully understand how interconnected everything was, and now we're having to pay the price of that. The issue is that we took that little bit of lack of knowing and we acted literally on a continent-sized scale, where we like clear-cut mass swaths of forest to feed this kind of economic growing machine, and used jobs and quote-unquote progress to justify it all. And then now, 30 years down the road, we're like, whoa, there's so much more to these ecosystems than we ever thought, and in doing all that, we like totally wrecked them. Yet that decision was guided by the science of that time. And now that the science has changed, we know better. We're kind of like at a loss because we've already acted on improper data. So I think it's yes, having the humility to like acknowledge that we never fully understand a situation, but also recognizing to just like pump the brakes and slow our roll and recognize that because we don't know everything, maybe we shouldn't act for everything, like we shouldn't We should be taking small steps, like just slowing our roll and like really learning to recognize the place we're in and how fragile these ecosystems are and how much more difficult and costly it is, economically speaking, to try to fix problems of the past than it is to just like walk with an air of confidence walk with an air of caution.
Cautiousness.
There it is.
But it's true. Yeah. Like, I think that, if you're looking at it, it's like, oh, like maybe we should be spot testing things, or, like put a toe in and like test if this is the right way to go, instead of just diving in and saying, this is what we're doing. And then, having to go back and say, like, how do we repair this damage now? Like, can we even get this like tree species back? Are we able to grow this back? Like, look at the rainforest, it's stuff like that where it's like, how do you reconcile some of these things? Some of it you can't. Like, there's no way we'll be able to repair some of the damage that's.
I also think it's kind of an arrogant human thing to be like, what can we repair? Because it's like at the end of the day, like nature is always changing. The world is always changing. We are an active part of nature. And in the long run, like the long grand scheme of Earth, like us humans are going to die out way before trees go extinct. Like, we're on course to destroy ourselves far before we're ever going to destroy species, like these certain tree species, for example. Like, yes, we're at the beginning of like an Anthropocene, like a big global wide die-off of many different species. Yes, sure.
Can I have you explain what Anthropocene means too? Like, for anybody that maybe that's their first time hearing it.
The Anthropocene, quote unquote, is this concept of humans being responsible for what is the beginnings of, we are currently living through the sixth mass extinction. Now, all throughout the history of the planet, there have been 5 major mass extinctions. There's like the Precambrian one, the big one, the dinosaur one. Everybody knows about that one. And most of these extinctions, I think only the dinosaur one was the most like radical one, in that like it literally wiped 98% of the planet's species off the face of the earth within 24 hours to 48 hours. That's an insane fun fact that I could ramble about if you want to hear about that another time, but let me get through this. But then like many of the other ones were these really slow, long changing processes, like the Precambrian, for example, where like volcanic activity created like a different chemical layout in the atmosphere, and that changed the ocean acidity, and it basically ended up slowly killing a lot of things over a long time. We're kind of in that type of mass extinction event right now. So it's like, it's not one thing where we're going to wake up tomorrow and half the species on the planet are going to be dead. But starting, I think people who subscribe to the Anthropocene, or like where this concept comes from, this isn't technically like a geologically logged record, because we're not actually in the geological time. What am I saying? The different layers, like this isn't like a geologically logged event. Does that make sense? But it's assumed to have started kind of around like Industrial Revolution times. As soon as we started like really ramped up in production of carbon emitting technology, and kind of going across the globe and like, cutting down rainforest, mass modifications to all sorts of different ecosystems and replacing them with crop plantations for agricultural use. That's when we really start to see this great die-off of all these different species that just haven't been able to adapt to these changes fast enough. And that's what we're creating with climate change. Like, climate change is the beginning of this sort of anthropocentric or Anthropocene, where we are in some way responsible for the previous and future deaths and loss and extinction of many different species across this planet that simply can't adapt to the changes that are coming fast enough.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, for anyone who's like first hearing that, they might be like, what is that even? Or like, what is that term? So that's really great for people to like know that terminology, because I've seen it, it is in conversations like around like the climate activist or like advocate space, but this may be the first time.
And there's it's an interesting thing. There's this person, Timothy Morton. They are a philosopher. Yeah, they're a philosopher that does a lot of, I'm trying to think about what their byline is. It's like the poet philosopher of the Anthropocene, because this whole concept can be really like overwhelming and leave you feeling like pretty, I don't know, it's pretty existential when you think about the fact that us humans over the past 300 years have created something that's going to be responsible for up to 98 to 99% of all life on this planet, if not more. it's really, yeah, that's heavy. That hits.
Yeah.
But Timothy Morton,
Yeah.
they've done some incredible work in writing, and I would recommend anybody picking up one of their books because I think the ecological thought is a great one. But they do a really good job of just like breaking down the situation and recognizing the humanity in it and the things that we can all do to kind of unite together and work in solidarity with humans and non-human beings to kind of create this world that works for everybody through this really kind of dark time that we live in. So cool reading.
Okay. I'm going to take
It's
that
difficult
recommendation for
reading.
myself too. Yeah.
They're out there.
As it would be. I mean,
Yeah.
these topics are not easy, and they're heavy, and it's, like, yeah, this could challenge people's way of thinking, to have to like think in
Right.
this like very grand scheme kind of thing. But I think that we need more of
Mm-hmm.
that too, of thinking, again, beyond ourselves, and like this big thought of like, there are billions of people on this planet, and like what we are able to do when we're all moving in a direction, good or bad, that we can impact things positively or negatively in a very
well, and I think
scale.
that's kind of the message behind a lot of these books and these works from Timothy. And just to paraphrase, they have a book called Being Ecological. That one, great intro book to this concept. But the kind of overall message there is that like, whether or not you think of yourself as like an ecologically minded being, you are ecological. If you're a painter and you don't give a shit about trees or the earth or anything, but you're painting, like you're painting on paper, you're using oils and things that are derived from the planet. So it's like whether or not you are, or you think of yourself as an ecological person, you are being ecological. If you are a race car driver and you're burning fossil fuels to go around the track on a metal and plastic thing, it's like you might not think of yourself as an environmentally minded person at all, but everything you are using, from those metals that were mined from the earth to the oil, like all of that is from nature. You are being ecological. And I think a lot of the work that we all as individuals and as a society need to do is come to terms with this idea that we are not separate from nature and that there is no real such thing as nature. I find the name Nerdy About Nature, like that started as a joke, and like at its core is such a joke because nature in my mind doesn't exist. Like there is no such thing as nature. Even this room that I'm in here, like plaster on the walls, plastic lighting up above, like this glass, like all these things. It's, we like to build our walls and have nature's outside. This is the human world in here, but all this stuff is made from nature. As soon as the windows open, where's the separation? It's like we're all part of this world, whether or not we want to accept that. And no matter how much we try to hide from it or shut ourselves away or get away from it, we will always be part of that which we call nature. So I think it's just about like us trying to come to terms with this and recognizing that we all are working symbiotically within these systems, within these cycles, and that if we do harm to one cycle, it's going to be us that sees that harm come back around to us full circle. So we need to find ways to just like work better within these systems.
Yeah. And together, like you said, it's like us working together with nature, with the environment, with like plants and species and everything else, instead of like we're two separate things that don't actually connect. But it's like, we are interwoven together. Like this is something, whether you want to agree with that or not, it is the truth. That is the reality of like what is around us. Like we are all interconnected in ways like we could not avoid it. If you want the things that we have, like they're coming from the environment, they're coming from the ground, they're coming from the planet. Like there's no way around it. And I think that's such an important thing to be advocating for. Is just
and that goes back to those hidden costs that I was talking about earlier. It's like even today, if we think about the price tags we pay for things, the costs that we can see are the impact on those ecosystems, on those kind of giant global scale ecological systems and cycles that we're impacting, that like maybe we don't pay for, but our kids are going to pay for it. So it's like going with that mindset into it is like, is that going to make you consume differently, knowing that like that product you bought from Walmart is impacting clean water in a part of the world that's going to impact the salmon or the fish that your kids are feeding on, that's going to give them cancer in 20 years or not. So it's like all of it is connected, and we can't just like think about it and isolate it, be like, oh, I need a table, so I'm going to pick this up right now and not care about where it came from or where it goes. There's so much more to it that we've just been conditioned to not have to think about out of comfort.
Yeah. I kind of want to take a major turn and like a step back, because like I'm talking to you and we're interacting. I'm I'm able to see right now, like just like how impassioned you are, and you just know so much. So I kind of want you to like tell me about where this came from. I feel like you know so much. So it's like, where did this interest come from? How have you learned so much? Like, did you go to school to like learn about environmental like anything, or like are you just reading tons of books? Like where is this coming from? Because you
Yeah.
just know so much.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know what to say. I think
Yeah.
because I've talked with like a lot of kids, and I've like have done some stuff with like school groups in the past, and like one of the things that I'm always trying to talk about is just like staying true to your passions and figuring that out. So
Yeah.
I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State, and like super privileged. Like I recognized, like I didn't come from like the wealthiest families, or we weren't like, I wasn't like privileged like flying around places, but just privileged in that I had a close family that really loved to do things outside, and I recognized that is a privilege that not a lot of people have.
Yeah.
So like my dad would always take us, like in the summertime we were swimming, we were water skiing, we were doing like just kayaking around, we were in the water, and in the wintertime we were skiing, we were just like on the slopes, like just doing all that stuff. And then everywhere in between I was just like running around in the forest and building tree houses and falling into stinging nettles and just getting like exploring through like mistakes basically. And that gave me like a really, not only like really great outlook on life, I think, just like being able to like, like, yeah, you might get muddy and dirty and you might hurt yourself a little bit, but you're going to live, like you're going to have fun along the way. Type 2 type fun, right?
Yeah.
Just like, yeah, that mentality.
Yes, that's right.
That, but then it's also given me this really great love and appreciation for all these little things that you witness when you're out there in the woods as a kid, like just like a little bug crawling into a piece of bark. You're like, what the heck is that?
Yeah.
And then you find out, 20 years later or something, like reading a book, like, oh, that's what that was. Little things like that. But then going to school, I was really bad at math in elementary school. Horrible. And so much so that I still carry that with me today. Like I get so, like if I have to do basic addition in front of somebody else, I freeze up inside. I was so traumatized as a kid because of that. And I've never been able to fully like, kind of rebound from that, I guess. So when it came time to go to school, even though I loved nature and loved the outdoors and did all that, like I started to go to school for biology, but like the numbers and chemistry and all of the like data recording, like it just triggered me too much. And I could not do it for the life of me. So then I was able to go to school in Montana, and I blended that kind of love for the outdoors with filmmaking, which gave me the opportunity to basically continue to play outside. And like I have been fortunate enough to travel to some really amazing parts of the world for work. See some incredible environments, some incredible landscapes. But then I've always just had that kind of natural intuition of been like, oh, what is that? So like I'd go to Japan and I'd see a really cool tree, and I'd come home like at the end of the day and I'd be like just Googling like, what is that tree? And I'd like learn all about that tree, and just like kind of would just like go down the rabbit hole of something that I loved or had like a little bit of interest in, and then just like ran with it to a point when I basically like, I, have downloaded like all sorts of books, like full on like college textbooks that I've just like read for fun. Like I'm halfway through a book on hydrology in British Columbia right now, just because it's fucking cool. Like I just enjoy it. So I've just spent like all of my kind of free time outside of my quote unquote work, just kind of researching the stuff because I've just genuinely been interested in it.
And you have just like that strong drive of curiosity. I feel like that's like one of the most important things, is like getting curious about your surroundings, getting curious about how things work, or like, hearing about something and saying, well, I'm going to dive in because I want to know more about that, or like how that works, or what we're doing about this certain thing, or, like there's so much that can be said about just getting curious about something and not just like passing it off to be like, oh, well, that's just there. It's interesting, but that is what it is. It's like, well, what is that? How can I identify it? Where does it come from? There's just so much to be said about like having that innate drive.
Yeah, and it gives it a totally different vibe too. It's like if you know something because you were forced to learn it, it's a different style of knowing it, as opposed to like, I'm genuinely interested and like want to know about this and love this,
Do you remember vividly, like, if there was anything from growing up that like kind of sparked that, where you were like, I'm gonna get books on this subject, or like I'm gonna download a textbook about this thing? Like, was there something that first kind of became that hook, or was it just always there and it's just a part of you?
I mean, I was super into dinosaurs as a kid. So like dinosaurs was kind of
Okay.
like the first drug that I found, and then moving from that, like I had like a different favorite animal every like 6 months, and then like I would just go down the rabbit hole of
Okay.
like I loved sea otters, and I would just books on sea otters. I would read all about sea otters. I would draw sea
Gotta know
otters in like art
everything.
class. It was like, and this is like third, fourth grade, like just full 100% otters, and then the next day I'd be like, switch something else, and I'd just be like,
All right, so it's like 0 to 100. You're like, this is the thing, and then you learn everything you possibly
yeah, I
can
mean
about
more
that
or less. And
subject.
then I think like through that there's like things that were reoccurring. Like I always came back to trees. Trees have kind of always been this thing that I've always come back to, just because they literally anchor these ecosystems together, and they're so radically different from humans.
Hmm.
Like they're slow, they're like methodical, there's like this wisdom to them that you can't quite put a finger on. But I think like
Mm.
I took kind of a hiatus, I'd say, from like kind of like learning and nerding out about things like through my 20s, maybe. Like just got caught up like trying to have a career in film and outdoor sports, and like doing all this stuff and not really thinking about it too much. And then eventually kind of coming back to it out of my own, like just being passionate about it and reading more books and stuff about it. And then like I was always kind of looking for, I've always wanted to do more environmental documentary, and I've had projects about forestry
Yeah.
that I've been trying to pitch for like, God, it's got to be close to a decade now. Like on like, so, but I was
Wow.
always kind of like, I felt like I always needed like one charismatic host person who could like narrate and talk about it, but I could never find that person. And then I think through like these social media videos
Hmm.
and stuff, like all this, I'm like, oh my God, like
Should've
I'm
been
just
you.
that guy. Like I just need to start doing this shit. So, um, yeah, it's kind of just
Yeah.
snowballed from there and given me an avenue to kind of, I think, using that film background, that background in like communications and like working with people and sharing narratives.
Yeah.
It's taught me a lot about what it means to, about what it means and how to share this information in a way that makes it approachable for every person, everybody. You
Yeah. Well, like from an outsider's perspective, you're doing a great job of that, because I feel like I know some stuff, like I don't know a lot. I'm not at your level of like textbooks on things, but I feel like it's, yeah, personable and approachable, and it's accessible, and like you can walk away from those videos and be like, "Oh, now I know something. Like I've learned something, and
know?
it's going to like stick with me." It's not just like in one ear out the other kind of stuff. And this is like a perfect segue, because one of the things I'm curious on is like how you come up with all of the different topics that you end up talking about, because I feel like there's so many, you talk about so many diverse
Right?
topics and like make videos about them. I'm like, where does that come from? Are you just like out and you're just like, oh, I want to talk about this tree, or like I want to talk about old growth forest, or like it's animals too, like all different
Yeah, I
kinds.
don't really have a formula. I think some of it, so some of the topics and stuff have been born from like recent political happenings, especially stuff pertaining to old growth, where it's like,
Yeah.
okay, I know that I need to like talk about the difference between an old growth forest and a second growth forest. So how can I do that?
Do you want to talk a little bit about that actually? Because I don't know that, when you said that there are like current things happening in Canada and stuff, a lot of people probably don't know.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. Do you want to do you want to book?
If you want.
No, it
Unless this is
is. It
like a
is.
really
I
big.
could. Do you want to bookmark that, and I'll come back to that in just a sec here.
Sure.
Just to finish
Yeah.
this thought about talking about the process. So,
Yeah.
there are issues that come about, and I'm like, okay, like I need to talk about this because there's a deadline for, to call in to this representative to get something happening, or there's a really important bill being passed, and like this is important to educate people about because it's happening right now. So there's like
Yeah.
that type of stuff that I'll like work through and script out, and like even like have a pre-written thing so I kind of know what I'm saying, like bullet pointed. Um, and then there are
Yeah.
other times when I'm just like out in the woods, and something that I've like read recently or something that's like fresh on the mind will pop up, and I'll like just have something to talk about, just share it like candidly in the woods. And then it usually starts out with me like trying to say one thing, doing a couple takes, and then getting it, and then be like, oh, I should say this too, right? So then I'll do it again, and I'll try to say that other thing, and I'm like, oh, but I forgot about this. So then I end up like trying to just like pack in all this information into one video, and then by the end of it, I'm just like talking as fast as I humanly can. I'm just like, by the time the video's over. So yeah, it snowballs on itself very quickly. But I think a lot of it is just like, yeah, just like spending the time in the outdoors and allowing myself to kind of be creative and find that like flow state, if you will, and like just enjoy it.
I think that just goes back to like that level of just that innate curiosity too, of just being out there and being like, oh, like I want to know more about that. I'm sure other people do too. Or, like I want to educate about this thing that's happening, and, someone else is going to find value in this too. Like, I just think that's it's a very cool trait to have that kind of like, just that curiosity, and then like wanting to translate that into something that's informative for other people.
To be fair, I don't think I've ever looked up something and been like, oh, I want to know this so that I can show other people about it. It's always been like I will be interested, and then I'll research it and I'll find it. I'll be like, oh my God, that's the fucking coolest thing in the entire world. And then I want to like share that with anybody who will listen. And it turns out quite a few people are actually think some of this stuff is pretty fun too. Yeah.
A lot of people.
Pretty cool.
A lot of people want to be nerdy about nature.
Everybody can be a nerd in their own right. It's great.
Yeah. And I just feel like it's such a benefit to have something out there that's just so palatable and fun and interesting, and still touches on, like tough topics sometimes, and like really heavy things, or like you said, like sense of urgency, like this is happening right now, but you're doing it in a way that like does welcome people in and like invites them to the table to have that conversation, instead of it being like, I don't know, like you're forced to learn this, you're forced to listen. Like it seems more fun and enjoyable to get the information and to make a decision on how you're going to like utilize that.
And I think that again goes kind of back to like the ethos of it. It's like learning should be fun. This is something that like we all should be like engaged with and want to be engaged with, but the systems and the kind of way that it's taught to us or like shared with us or forced upon us just hasn't been fun, and as a result it's driven a lot of people away from it. Just like I don't like math. Like all it took was for one person to be kind of bad at it in like second grade, or like not care for it or get made fun of for getting something wrong, and then like that can stick with them for their whole life. And like, we really have to create a society where we can have some sense of accountability and forgiveness, and like learn to grow past these traumas that every one of us experiences. Even if that is just like a minor little thing. Like I'm not saying it was like it ruined my life.
But when you're a kid, it is bigger. Like when you're young, like these minor things are not so minor, because it does stick with
they
you.
have a way of shaping the outcome of your life. So it's like, if we can learn to just, I don't know, keep people stoked and have more fun with life, I think it's just going to make life more fun and easier for everybody.
Absolutely. I feel like you are living by that ethos very well.
I have my moments.
Yes. Yeah. You're doing an amazing job. I kind of want to go back on, just sharing a little bit more about the current events that are happening in Canada too, because you've mentioned a little bit like, I want to share if it's like time sensitive, or, there's certain things happening right now that are more to do with like forestry and like old growth forests and things like that. And you mentioned like old growth versus second growth, I think. Yeah, I would love for you to just take some time to educate on like the current climate, or like the issues at hand, because I feel like many of us probably won't know a lot about what's happening in Canada, or like that this is a bigger issue that's happening right now.
Okay. This is so complex and complicated. Let me think about the best way to go about this. So 1492, Columbus comes over to Turtle Island, to North America. And at that point, you have thousands of indigenous communities living all across Turtle Island in what are known as primary forests, or these mature forest stands. Basically, the entire continent. And there's different types of forests. Like there's a lot of chestnut and stuff on the East Coast, many more deciduous trees, more conifer trees throughout the West, and especially the West Coast here. That's all relative to how different coniferous trees and deciduous trees rose and evolved following the Cretaceous period. That's a whole nother thing. How, anyway, so
Okay.
you have these indigenous communities that are living with reciprocity amongst these landscapes. And yes, they're logging, they're doing the things, they're using the forest for their resources, but they're doing it in a way where it never takes more from these ecosystems and these ecosystems can naturally provide, right? Fast forward a couple hundred years, colonization sweeps Turtle Island. There's the mechanization of all sorts of logging. So colonization sweeps Turtle Island. Early 1900s, you still have a lot of those same sort of values embedded in how logging happens, like especially like, you know, the late mid 1800s, like there's a lot of hand falling going on, people using skid rows and horse drawn horses to draw out big logs where they're milled locally on site. You're using natural waterways to get logs around. You're never operating at a scale that really destroys the ecosystem too much. And there's even still, there's like bigger trees that you just still can't get to. And then after World War II, you have this mechanization of the industry, like I've talked about, where all of a sudden you have technology that just like cranks, or you're basically bringing tanks from the war field in Europe to the forests in your backyard, and you're cutting down vast swaths of forest. You're towing them all out by these massive trucks that are like designed specifically to tow out massive old growth trees. And you're doing this all across the continent, basically. So there aren't any exact figures on it because there's never actually been a nationwide study done on it. But actually, Biden just on Earth Day announced this plan to catalog all of the old growth in the United States, which is really amazing because we'll actually finally get a number on how much is remaining. But estimates right now, kind of vary between like 92% and 99.9% have all been logged or are gone. I kind of think it's probably somewhere around like the maybe 3%, 2% ish of all of the forests in the United States are still old primary forests, meaning that they're that kind of mature state forest, which is different in every ecosystem. Like a mature old growth forest and on the East Coast is going to be different than it is in the Midwest, than it is in Colorado, than it is in Washington or Oregon State. It's all different, but still, they're all like these old growth mature ecosystems. And everything else that we consider to be forest is what's known as a second growth forest, which has either been a forest that was logged and replanted either by humans in a logging effort or reseeded naturally. So you just have a younger natural forest that exists there. So that's happened all across North America. In the 1990s, there was a thing called the Timber Wars in the States, based out of Oregon, where a lot of people started protesting the cutting down of the last of the redwoods in California, of which I'm pretty sure only 3% remains of just the redwoods. More of the kind of coastal coniferous Douglas fir forests up through Oregon and stuff. And that resulted in a lot of sweeping changes throughout the forest practices code and the way that things operated there, kind of throughout the mid-90s. And for the most part, anything that wasn't cut down kind of on the coast then is basically all the old growth forests we have left remaining. And there's still some private tracts throughout Oregon, Washington, and California that occasionally like go up for sale to timber companies. They're still being logged, or they get bought into conservation lands. But, you know, a lot of it is being threatened these days with wildfires and stuff because there are a whole host of issues that we've created within our second growth forests as a result of all this like hyper management that we've been doing. So basically in Canada, what happened last summer is we kind of had around the same time in the 90s as the Timber Wars, we had the War in the Woods, which is basically the same thing happening up here in Canada. We had a bit of a resurgence with that because a new report came out in 2020 or 2019. The Last Stand for Forest for Diversity in Old Growth Forests. It's an amazing report, independently produced by some really high stake, well-known ecologists and biologists. So it's like really well-written report. They basically detailed the lack of remaining old growth throughout just British Columbia. And basically that of the highest producing, biggest, grandest trees we have in British Columbia, there's less than 1% left. and it's all still actively being
Oh
logged
my
today.
gosh.
Like logging is one of the biggest industries in British Columbia. I think the timber industry alone outputs 10.10 at least 10 billion annually every year. So it's a really big industry. The issue
Wow.
with it though is that like so much of it has been mechanized that it's not actually producing the amount of jobs and wealth and in these communities that we would like to see. So just like after the timber
Yeah.
wars in the States and Oregon and Washington, you had all these logging companies that went belly up and couldn't, they had to pull out of these communities. So you have all these communities that fell on hard times, these
Yeah.
old kind of abandoned logging towns. Which is just a terrible thing because they weren't logging
Yeah.
sustainably from the get-go. So we see that same kind of thing happening here. So there's been a resurgence of that kind of like movement to save the last of the remaining old growth forest before it's too late. And so
Okay.
last year, there was this thing called the
Yeah.
Fairy Creek blockades, which was protecting the last kind of intact watershed on southern Vancouver Island that hadn't been logged, protecting that from
Mhm.
having logging roads gone in and having that clear cut because a company got the license to do that from the government without consent from the indigenous nations on whose land that is happening on. And
Mhm.
mind you, that basically over the past 150 years of all this logging happening, like none of that had consent from indigenous nations on it, like very little. So it's also worth noting that a couple years ago, Canada committed to honoring UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, which essentially is like honoring their sovereignty and their ability to have a say and control what happens on their land. So Canada committed to this, and then
Yeah.
this whole Fairy Creek thing blows up, and now it's this big kind of like ethical, legal, cultural limbo where we're trying to figure out what it means to have industry and still be able to log, but then do so in a way that honors and respects Indigenous, not only their communities and give them, you know, like money for it, but like do it in the way that they would do it, like returns it to Indigenous led stewardship. And the
Yeah.
reality is that we've created a system
Yeah.
all across Turtle Island that like basically favors the lowest input logging practices, which is clear cut, because it's the most cost effective. And to do it in a more responsible way suddenly
Right.
means you have to account for all of the other factors and costs that you haven't been accounting for. So, you know, from water quality to slope stability to fire prevention, all these things that are associated with second growth forests. So we're kind of in this really interesting era of like trying to reshape and redirect the way that the forest industry is going and how it operates, but then do so in a way that creates more indigenous led conservation, indigenous led logging, like and do it all in a way
Yeah.
so that like we can still have logging, but we're not doing it in a way that destroys the world for our future kids. We're still supporting these communities, but we're not doing it
Yeah.
in a way that's going to like leverage their economic prosperity over the ecological functioning of the forests, you know. So it's an interesting time to say the least because we're all just kind of trying to figure it all out together. So I've been trying to do a lot when it comes
Yeah.
to like educating people about the pros and cons of the way that we've been logging and all the kind of intricacies of this whole big nationwide global system that we have, because it is so complicated and there's so
Yeah.
many ins and outs to it, and it's not just like as easy of a conversation of just like you can't have like one banner that sums it up and stand on the street corner and like there's so many nuances, and really it is a thing where we all have to like
Yeah.
work together and learn to see things through each other's perspectives and have these conversations at a round table where everybody has the opportunity to speak and be heard equally, which has never existed before, you know?
Yeah. Right. And even, yeah, even like, you know, like you were saying, like allowing, you know, indigenous communities and tribes to like take the lead. Like this is something that I mean, this should have
Mm.
always been in place, but it will be new to have like these voices at the table, giving perspective, like, you know, giving guidance saying, hey, this is the way it should be done. Like, this is how we've been doing it for
Mm-hmm.
centuries in this way. And like, you should adopt these kinds of, I don't know what the word
Practices
is
almost?
that I'm trying to look for.
Yeah.
These strategies, yeah, practices and strategies, you know, like that there is a way to, you know, work with the land and with the trees, and instead of just completely bulldozing everything and saying, well, this is what we want, so this is the
Well,
way
and
we're
then
gonna
and
do it.
then with that
Yeah.
too, there's an added layer of complication because a lot of these indigenous nations are operating under elected band councils, which is something that was implemented from the Indian Act back in 1872 or something like that. So there's a lot of like a lot of cultural unlearning that we're also reckoning with. It's like, what does it mean to be living in a colonist state here? Like, how do we like, yes, go about honoring the sovereignty of these nations, but do so in a way that isn't just through another colonist guise of a system that we've created and like enforced upon them. Like, it's complicated.
Yeah, it is. And it's just like more
Right.
constructs, more rules, more regulations, when really it's like we should deconstruct, deregulate, and give more, just having more freedom and flexibility to just like take on and like allow others to I guess have the reins in a lot of ways, than us just trying to like regulate that in a different way and create more rules and like more constraints around it in a way that like makes people feel
but you know, power is probably the most influential drug known to humankind, and the reality is that like a lot of the people who have control and power right now, often rich white men who have benefited from decades of colonization, don't want to just relinquish that power. So there's all sorts of lobbying and greenwashing happening to kind of keep things maintaining the status quo and not actually succumbing to that change.
Yeah, they're like such complex issues, and I'm happy that this conversation has kind of gone where it's gone, because I feel like this is potentially the first time people are even hearing about some of these issues, or like even, you know, different acts and like different things that have happened in the past. Like there's a lot of things that this may be, like a history lesson in some ways, but it's also so important to like know that these are happening in real time, and like this is stuff that people are advocating for every day. They're out there using their voices. They're trying to like, you know, make change, but like this is all stuff that doesn't get a lot of airtime, or, you know, this isn't what you're seeing on your Instagram feeds necessarily most of the time. So it is really important to have that information.
Yeah, and to that information point, I mean, like there's so much of it too that is like information that has changed or information that has just come about recently. So I get a lot of trolls from the logging industry who want to say that like that these forests are old or dying anyway, and they're just cleaning them up, and that this is actually better, or that younger trees are better for climate change because they soak up more CO2 and sequester it, versus old trees. Like there are all these sort of like bullet point talking points that I hear people say, and it just kind of goes down to like dismissing this misinformation that was basically industry propaganda in the 90s, those same kind of timber war era mantras that people started buying into. That's still very prevalent and relevant today. So, you know, I've had to talk to so many like friends down in Washington who are like, oh, I love that one forest, it's so cool to like look at. I'm like, that's actually like, not only is it like ecologically fucked, but that's a fire hazard. Like that, if, you know, so let me talk about a little bit about old growth and second growth forests. Very, very generalized, because it varies significantly in each ecosystem, but at least here in the Pacific Northwest, like Washington, Oregon, Northern California, up through British Columbia and Alaska, what's typically known as Cascadia. I love to use the bioregion reference because it gets rid of all of these arbitrarily drawn political lines that separate us all, even though we're all the same here, living on the same waters. Like the Columbia River starts in British Columbia. So old growth forests, typically out here, they're defined by the government as a forest that is over 250 years on the coast, and 140 years in the interior. Now, these old growth forests, they perform numerous ecological functions, mostly stemming from the fact that they're just these really rich, diverse, like massively biodiverse ecosystems. So you have different spacings between trees, you have different ages of trees, different species of trees, that all kind of helps to facilitate this function, whether it be providing obviously clean air, which we all love to breathe, but then filtering the water, using that water to store it in a way so that it doesn't erode the landscapes and doesn't silt up the rivers down below, so that it works within to create all these different microclimates that everything kind of needs to survive, to grow rich and strong and vibrant and healthy for all the wildlife, humans included, that rely on these ecosystems. And when we clear cut them down, or cut them down and replace them with the second growth forest, there are a couple big distinctions. So firstly, a second growth forest is a replanted or naturally seeded crop of forest that is often a monoculture or sometimes a mixed stand of very limited trees, usually trees that were replanted because of their high economic return. So more interior, this is going to be a lot of pine trees. More out here on the coast, it's going to be a lot of Douglas fir trees. So these stands are planted really tight together, trying to maximize the square footage to grow as many trees as we can. They're all the same age and they're all the same species. So what this does is it creates a monoculture of trees that are all subject to the same type of disturbances. So if an insect were to come through that prefers a bunch of these tree species at the same age, it's just going to have a heyday. Take, for example, the mountain pine beetle, kind of early 2000s. We had all these stands of second growth pine trees that we had planted all over the interior because we logged the initial old, really resilient old growth forest that had spacing between the trees, that had diversity of tree species at different ages. So you had really old matriarch trees with really young matriarch trees, with really young trees growing up kind of in the same environment. Without that diversity, you had a mountain pine beetle come in, and all of a sudden, every single pine tree here was exactly what it wanted. And not only that, they were all so tightly packed, they were all trying to compete with one another, which means that all of their immune systems were really low because they're just trying to grow as fast as they can to outcompete the ones that surround them. So mountain pine beetle came in, and it was just like a buffet. They just devoured everything, and then now we're left with all these stands of dead trees. That is a horrible fuel for wildfires. And that was all because we logged it irresponsibly from the get-go. So these second growth stands, they lack that diversity. Like I said, they're all really tight together. They often have ladder fuel. So trees, as they grow, they will naturally shed their lower branches as they age. With a second growth forest, everything is competing so readily with all of its neighbors that they don't do that as often. They're focused on just growing straight up. So they're growing really fast as they can. And those lower branches end up staying on there. So what that does is it creates a ladder fuel, which means that if there's some sort of fire that breaks out, that fire quickly climbs those trees into the canopy of the trees, and then it spreads like literal wildfire all throughout that forest, that monoculture forest that's all the same age. And that's where a lot of the fires that we're facing here in the West, in Washington, Oregon, BC, every summer, those are all happening in young plantation forests of these second growth forests. They're not old growth fires happening. Because these old growth trees, these old growth forests, one tree will grow really big and die out and it'll fall over and it'll create a gap in the canopy that allows sunlight to come in so that younger trees can grow and fill that gap. And as this happens over hundreds of years, thousands of years even in some cases, depending on where you are, you get this all sorts of diversity and understory that grows here that helps absorb water when it rains and filter that water when it runs off. So if a fire does break out, it's a much damper, moisture environment that doesn't even allow for that fire to spread in the first place. So when we have these second growth forests that are really tightly packed and super dense, no light is able to come through the forest floor. So often it's just a completely bare dirt floor with nothing living in it, which means that you're not going to have food for any kind of deer or birds or berries. Nothing is growing there. So it's often becomes pretty wildlife devoid, as well as lacking any of the habitat for any wildlife. So you don't have big tree stumps or massive stumps where bears are able to den, or even marmots or little fishers, any smaller critters are able to den. So everything basically leaves, and you can go into some of these second growth forests and it sounds empty. There's maybe you might hear a raven kind of calling throughout the canopy, but for the most part, there's not a lot living there. So it's just this, there are a million things. Those are kind of the main ones we're dealing with. Oh, actually, I should mention floods too, because without that lack of understory in the old growth forest, you have a lot less interception of water when it rains. So rainwater comes through in a second growth forest, and where it normally would be soaked up by all the mosses and the understory there, it hits the ground. So boom, splatters, dirt goes everywhere. It reduces, so it creates all sorts of erosion where you have water that is quickly swept away from the soils, that surface area flow that then goes down and muddies up and silts up rivers down below, which impacts salmon habitat, which then impacts algae blooms. It's just this whole trickle down effect that we see happening from just the sediments being removed. And then when you don't have all that moss and everything to kind of retain those waters, you also get a lot more water seeping into those soils. So you have a lot of subsurface flow within those soils, and without those those bigger trees, of the old growth forest and all of the understory, the diverse understory with all their like little nuances of roots holding all the soil together. Without all of that, all of a sudden you have
Yeah.
increased of water in between all of the soil particles. It reduces friction, and you get massive landslides. So, and with those landslides comes obviously like all sorts of flooding as they dam up rivers, and things happen. It's just this horrible, chaotic event. So last fall up here in British Columbia and in Washington, and I believe in Oregon too, there were some pretty gnarly floods. A lot of floods happened as these like landslides, like literally Vancouver, the city was an island for a few weeks because every road in and out of the city connecting it to the rest of Canada had been wiped out by a flood.
We had just left. So
Really?
we did like a team like meetup in Vancouver, and we left the day before that happened. It was wild. Like just even seeing like the amount of rain they were getting and everything, like our team was letting us know that like we get a lot of rain. They're like, but not in this amount, like the short amount of time. Like this is very abnormal for us. And then there's like nothing to sustain or like, filter that water out. It was so
Right.
It was crazy to like, just be like, be in
Right,
touch with that,
because all this
Yeah.
like diversity of the forest, like a healthy old growth forest is able to intercept 30% of the water in a storm. So it's like, yeah, that was a freakishly big storm, but theoretically, if our forest ecosystems were healthy functioning states, it shouldn't have been an issue. Right.
It would have been able to.
But it was, and now that's cost how many billions in taxpayer dollars trying to rebuild those roads and highways and railways. Like everything was. If people listening to this haven't heard about this, you should Google BC floods 2021, and it will blow your mind. It's like fully apocalyptic. Like towns are gone, and even in Washington State back in 2000 something, the town of Oso got completely buried after a rainstorm. There was a landslide on a hill that had been logged not even 10 years prior, logged and replanted to second growth forest. Destroyed this entire town. I think it killed like 40 people. It's this like massive tragedy. And then it's like, but the logging company is not liable. They're like, oh, well, we did everything that the government told us we had to do. So we like logged it, then we planted trees. But it's like, we still just, we're in a state where we can't be thinking like this. Like we have to come up with better, at the end of the day, better policy and regulations that keep for-profit companies from literally raping and pillaging our hillsides and our landscapes for profit for the 1% people who own it and they're their shareholders, and not the rest of us who are all the stakeholders here, who have our lives here,
Yeah, and I guess like my question from this, because I feel like I've just learned a ton. I mean, you just dropped so much knowledge in like a small amount of time. Like this is truly like it's so eye-opening in so many ways. And I'm curious, like, what is the solution to that? Because if we don't have much like old growth left, like what is the solution to that? Like, are you layering, the planting and replanting of new growth trees so that they're growing at different times so then it becomes an old growth?
I'm
like,
super glad that you asked, actually. So I work for a company out here in Ucluelet, Redfish Restoration. That's REDD, like a salmon red. It's their nest, and it's a pun. Yeah. And so we do a lot of watershed restoration work, specifically within forests that have been damaged by all of the logging that's happened here. So this is like the heart of where those the war in the woods kind of took place here in Canada back in the 90s, because the logging throughout the Clayoquot Sound was just like immense, like full hillsides, top to bottom, watersheds, just all the logs removed. There's like crazy landslides destroying these rivers that were just like unraveling like in real time, and you can watch the salmon runs just dwindle. And yes, there are a lot of different factors impacting salmon runs, but habitat is one of the big ones. So within that, like we work a lot with forest restoration as a part of restoring these watersheds. So a lot of that is like working to stabilize hillsides, working to diversify second growth forests, and there are so many different methods that you can use. From going in and thinning these second growth trees to create standing dead trees and snags for wildlife trees. You're basically opening up gaps in the canopy to allow for light to come through so that understory can grow. And there's a ton of great work like that being done. The scale is huge, though. Like when you think about the scale that logging companies were operating for profit back then. Like they're
Right.
just like hectares upon hectares, like whole entire forested valleys just decimated. And I think we employ 30 people maybe, and going in by hand, and you hire
Okay.
fallers, and you're like taking out basically every other tree, and you're leaving a lot of that coarse woody debris on the forest floor to help kind of like rehabilitate these ecosystems. There's a lot of work to be done, and
Yeah.
it's basically all nonprofit funded. Like there's small grants and stuff that we're able to get, but like it's not a for-profit industry. So that's one part of the solution.
Right.
I personally think that another part of the solution has to come from industry, and it has to come from regulations. We have to find ways to incentivize companies to think differently. And the States is a whole other beast. The States, to be frank, is fucked because
Yeah.
because in the States,
Yeah.
everything basically here in Canada, it's a majority of all the logging operations still happen on crown land, or public land, so that
Okay.
these companies that operate are accountable to certain stipulations that the government can set about how their land is logged.
Right.
In the States, it was the opposite. Basically, like they sold land off to the railroad companies, who just like Weyerhaeuser is like the largest landowner in the United States, like terrible, evil, horrible corporation. Like, have you ever seen Fern Gully? That's basically like Weyerhaeuser.
Yes, I was just going to bring up Ferngully, that it's
I'm
like,
pretty
that
sure
is what I
Weyerhaeuser
envision.
I'm pretty sure that's who they
all
were. That was like the people they were targeting, and they're still around now. And they're a real estate company more than anything, because they just sell this land back to people trying to develop and find places to live, and they're making a killing doing it. But because that's private land, there's not as much say that the government can have as far as practices go. There's like a lot they can do moving forward in the realms
Right.
of like riparian area protections and what's allowed to happen, or sorry, the impacts it's allowed to have. But as for saying like you can't use these methods or you
Yeah.
can use these methods, there's not a whole lot they can say, which is terrible, because really,
Yeah.
like at least here in British Columbia, the logging industry is subsidized $365 million every year by taxpayers, and that's to continue the status quo of this like horribly consumptive machine that still advocates for clear cutting because it's the most economically viable. What we really need to do is reframe the industry so that it's not managed by these larger conglomerate companies, from Weyerhaeuser to Macmillan. Like there's so many ones after that need to be broken up, and I think having it return to a like smaller woodlot style of management, where you have smaller groups of people managing the land, who know these lands, who are like living amongst these lands. Because right now, like a lot of the fallers will live in one part of the province and get flown out for 2 weeks of work into like a man camp in the middle of nowhere, where they just cut it all down. There's no connection to that land, right? So we need to reestablish connection and management for that. And then with that, we need to find new ways of thinking and new ways of generating revenue to keep these communities afloat. And that, I feel like, comes down to like retrofitting mills and coming up with creative solutions for providing incentives to thin a lot of these forests. Like, if we had some sort of like, I don't know, hemlock, like Western hemlock subsidy or something that incentivized people to go into these second growth forests and take out 50% of the Western hemlock just to clear out enough space to allow light to come in and start to rehabilitate these ecosystems. Like, whether it's used for pulp or lumber or whatever it's turned into, it's difficult to do that in a thinning manner. It's really easy to just clear cut it all and tow it all out. But as soon as you're going through, you all of a sudden rely on incredibly skilled and specialized people like these fallers, who not only know this equipment and how to operate in these systems like better than anyone else, but you know these lands and know how to operate in these forests. And then you have to get it out, which is like, there are a lot of people that are reverting back to horse-drawn, like horse forestry, which is amazing, or even using 4x4s to tow stuff out. But then you need like some sort of makeshift road, and it's like nothing's perfect, and nothing is like totally impact free. But like, again, us humans are just a bunch of wild animals out here. Like, we need to recognize our role and take part in these ecosystems and in this management, and do it in a way that is actually constructive to its health, so that we can continue to benefit from it for centuries to come, not just in a one-time 70-year bang where we cut it all down and treat it like a crop of wheat, which is currently how it's all being modeled. So yeah, we just need to be able to get involved and get our hands dirty. And I think ultimately that means that, yeah, prices will probably go up a bit, but we've already been paying far too less for the quality of what we've been getting. Like, if anything, it's
Right.
like our system is backwards because we haven't been paying the full value of that wood. And yeah, it's going to cost more to manage it better, but that cost is going to come around full circle because our kids are going to be living in a world where they don't necessarily have to worry about horrible wildfire taking their house out every summer, or worry about, you know,
Yeah.
their roadways or schools or towns being taken out by floods in the fall. So what costs do you want to pay now, and what
Yeah.
costs do you want to pay in the future,
Yeah.
right?
So true. It's so true. I feel like this is like, yeah, this is such an amazing, I'm so excited for this episode to go out, just because I'm like, wow, I'm learning so much, and like, you're so passionate about it. And there's just so many calls to action in here too, or it's just like, here are these like tangible ways that you could potentially like learn more, get involved, like just start to advocate, or, you know, like seek more information, or talk to your, you know, state representatives, like different things that you can just start to pay attention to, because there is so much, and this is so important. And yeah, when you start to think about how closely intertwined we are, even with, you know, like with our forests, with nature in that way, it's like we need to be taking care of these spaces, of these areas, like doing what we can to preserve and conserve, because, you know, at the rate that we're going, there will not be a forest floor. There won't be like any places for our future generations to go. Like, what we speak about now won't even be here for them to observe. Or safely, because it's going to be constant like survival mode, because everybody's going to be stressed about the next catastrophic event that's going to happen, because we're already starting to see them like way more frequently than we should.
I mean,
yeah, I want to
I was just going to say, and not even like beyond that, like there's a lot that we have to do for sure when it comes to like mitigating climate change and creating health safe environments for us to like continue to live in. But from a purely like, I don't know, psychological, spiritual level, there's this concept of Shinrin Yuku, this Japanese forest bathing that's been totally trending like lately. Like, as soon as you start to become aware of like what a healthy forest is, it changes the way that you look at forests. Like, I personally get like really bummed out when I go back down to Washington and see family, because you know, there's forests everywhere in Washington, and you're looking at the hillsides and it's like, great, wow, look at all these trees, this is so amazing. But then you walk through there and it's like something out of like the Grimm brothers fairy tales, where it's like these dark forests that are like spooky and weird, like small scraggly trees, and it's like, that's not a healthy forest, and nobody should ever think that. And the fact that, you know, the baseline has shifted so much to where people in the States who like go on a hike to Mount Baker and they post these like photos of them in the forest, like, wow, I love this forest, it's so pretty. It's like, that's not a healthy forest. You're in like one of the worst, most degraded or degraded forest ecosystems that we have on this part of Cascadia, and you don't even recognize it. So it's like trying to get people immersed in and to understand the differences between these forests is like a really big thing. And there's like Grove of the Patriarchs around Mount Rainier, and there actually is like a really cool old growth grove around Mount Baker, Washington, and like in the Baker Forest there. But like all those national forests, like those aren't pristine forests, you know, they're national forests set aside for the use of man, as Gifford Pinchot laid out like in the early 1900s. So it's like, I don't know. I think people just like becoming aware of like what is around them and the true health and quality of it, and then learning to take stake in that, take not ownership, because that's like a very Western white thing to say, but like have a role in its health, and recognize that like you even going out for your weekend jaunt once a year to get a Instagram pic that you can post off and show off how outdoorsy you are, like you are an active part of that ecosystem, whether it be big or small, and we all have a role to play when it comes to rehabilitating them for the future health, wealth, and benefit of everything. So
yeah, I think a great takeaway too is like the planet is a caretaker to us, and we should be a caretaker back. Like, not even like an owner, but like we are caretaking. We should be nurturers as well, because the planet nurtures us every single day in everything that we do. And taking that active role to be a nurturer and like, caretake back is like, we can only do that. Like as fast as we are taking things away, like we should be reciprocating and giving back, and like trying to at least kind of instill that back into the planet of like giving thanks and then some.
And have you read any of Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, Braiding Sweetgrass, anything like that?
Braiding Sweetgrass was one of the most pivotal books that I've read, where it was just like, this is everything that I feel, like this is so important to me. And I feel like almost every time that I talk to someone who's kind of like in the environmental advocacy space, we end up talking about Braiding Sweetgrass, because it is so like, it is like that ethos of just like the most raw, real, like connection of just like, hey, I see what you're doing. Thank you for giving me berries to eat. Thank you for giving me water to drink. Thank you for the air that I'm breathing. And like, what can I do now to like give back to you, because you're doing this for me? And again, like, just being in mindset of like, everything around us is connected and it's alive, and it's like, it needs to be acknowledged and give thanks to it. And then, and then we reap abundance and we get more in return, because we're not just, taking with eventually nothing left.
It's like all about working within reciprocity and working within these systems, and never taking more than you are offered or given, or that the system can regenerate in the same period of time. Regarding the forest stuff, there's this really cool kind of pilot project that's been happening on the east coast of Vancouver Island, called Wildwood, and it's this type of forestry called ecoforestry, quote unquote. And it's really cool because it's basically following those guidelines for working within reciprocity within these ecosystems. So they never take more than from a forest ecosystem than that ecosystem can regenerate in a given amount of time. So basically,
love that.
For like 80 years now, it's like 80 years, 80 acres. It's been managed for timber as well as other values by initially the original landowner, and then now it's like run by a trust. In that amount of time, they've been able to generate more wood, like board feet, from the forest ecosystem, and generate more revenue by harvesting in like 3 to 5 year periods, 3 to 5 year increments, just like extremely selective logging, like based on what's already fallen, what's about to go, what's infected, and selecting for all these different factors, as opposed to had they just initially clear cut all the land and replanted when they got it 80 years ago. They're able to make more money and get more board feet return in that period of time than had they cut it all down from the get-go. And it's still a healthy, functioning, old growth forest ecosystem with like 800-year-old Douglas firs in there that are bigger around than this room I'm in right now. It's insane. And it's just like such a beautiful example of the way that we could still be operating and be creating, generating wood products, generating timber revenues, like getting people, creating jobs and opportunity for people by having people be so intimately connected to these lands and knowing these lands and knowing how to operate within them. Like it's such a beautiful example of what's possible. It's just a matter of implementing that on a larger scale and getting enough people to stop talking about Johnny Depp and Andrea Heard and start caring about the world around them.
Yeah. That's a perfect place to like wrap it up too, just to say it exactly like you just did. That was amazing. Yeah. We need more people to care about like the big picture than, the next tabloid
Every time you
event that's coming up.
Every time you post about Johnny Depp, you do your kids a disservice.
Ooh, that's our tagline for this. Yeah. Well, I want to just say thank you first and foremost. This is like such an amazing conversation. Like talking about tough subjects, but also like giving hope and like giving tangible efforts and things that people can do, things that they can research. Next steps. Beyond just like, well, everything's fucked. I think it's it's a testament of just like bringing awareness and letting people know that like these are real time events that are happening that can impact us and our future generations and people beyond that, and like the planet as a whole, not even just as humans, like the impact that we're having on our surroundings, and that call to pay more attention and be more mindful and intentional in like everything that we do. And it's so important. So thank you for this conversation, but also what you're doing on social media and just like, just continuously bringing these amazing topics and like things for people to think about and like look at differently and just gain perspective and information and educate themselves in a space that it's free and it's accessible and, it's fun. So I love that I've been able to share like so much time with you and just get to talk. I feel like we barely even scratched the surface because I had other questions I even wanted to get into, and I'm like, I could talk to you for so long. So maybe this will have to be like the first of like several conversations where we just like
I'll come chat.
Talk about Yes, perfect. Because I'm obviously like, man, it's almost been like 2 hours, and I'm like, we could just talk all day because this is just the best. It's amazing. So I have a couple wrap-up questions for you before I let you go. So the first is, where can people find you online? And then I want you to plug your podcast too.
You can find me on social media at Nerdy About Nature. On TikTok, I'm Nerdy About Nature. I have because I had an account, and then I ended up getting banned for a funny April Fool's joke that if you saw it and you know what I'm talking about, then like awesome. And if you didn't see it, then I think it's just better that I let that die. So yeah, Nerdy About Nature everywhere you go, except TikTok is Nerdy About Nature. And then, I have a podcast that I just started up, Nerdy About Nature, and you can find that on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Google, Amazon, anywhere you get your podcasts. And really cool kind of, I guess, experiment for me, just being able to like slow down and have longer conversations with more nuance with different individuals, different friends of mine, and people who are like specialists in different areas. So it's a new venture that I've been working on, and really stoked for that. So you should check that out for sure. And then you can also learn more about myself and all the different stuff at nerdyaboutnature.com. I have got like some merch out there with some stickers and goofy things. And you can also support the podcast by becoming a Patreon supporter. So that's kind of like the way that I've been operating. Like I'm deliberately choosing to kind of go more of an independently funded route, because it does take a lot of time and energy like an unbelievable amount of time and energy. And I want to be able to keep it keep it independent and not have to feel like I have to say certain things to appease sponsors, or not be able to say things for fear of making people unhappy. Like I don't want to get into that route. I don't want to get into that realm. So if you're enjoying the content, enjoying the stuff, would really appreciate the support on Patreon.
Yes. Yeah. Everyone, please go follow him, support him, just invest, because obviously, I mean, you have so much content. You're taking so much time, even just like through Instagram and like creating all of these different resources and like educational materials, whether you look at it like that or not. Like it's not a textbook, but it is. Like these are small like blurbs of just like resources and education and calls to action. So yes, please, everyone, follow him everywhere. Go listen to his podcast. Like you're such a great conversationalist, and like I feel like the conversations that you evoke are just like very thought provoking, and I feel like lead people to want to do more. So if you love this episode, I highly recommend you just go over there and subscribe and get involved with his stuff. And please obviously donate to his Patreon if you can. And share it with your friends and family just to like get the word out, and obviously do what you can to like raise awareness and share more information too. And then my last question for you is, what does keeping nature wild mean to you?
Well, so like I've said, I think nature is fake and not real, and not something that we should consider as outside of us. I think from like more of a philosophical perspective, it's important to keep nature quote unquote wild, and that like it's just us humans are naturally very inquisitive beings that are always trying to problem solve and look at things and like get curious about things. And I think that's what wild to me means, when it's like keep nature wild, is in like Always stay curious, always stay inquisitive, always never be afraid to stop exploring and getting out there and getting your hands muddy and getting your hands dirty and like working to create a better solution. Because, you know, the world that we've created has been created through a lot of inaction as much as it has been action. And the future that we will create is not going to be created by a bunch of desk jockeys tweeting their way to freedom. We all need to be able to get our hands dirty, get muddy, embrace the elements, and like, yeah, find our place amongst it and find a way to work amongst it in a way that promotes its health and thus promotes ours. So keep nature wild is, to me, like reminiscent of that idea of keeping engaged with it, keeping curious and inspired by it.
I love that. And that is like exactly what I would envision you to say, is be, inquisitive and curious and like, getting involved, being engaged, like having that true connection to everything that's around you instead of just being like on the sidelines. So that is a beautiful response and perfectly wraps up everything that we've been talking about. So thank you so much for sharing so much time with me. This has been amazing, and I cannot wait for people to hear this. Like, I'm so excited. So, thank you for a wonderful kind of like midday thought-provoking conversation on a Monday. This was really great. So
thank you so much, Bree. It's been great having me on and talking about all this stuff with you. Awesome.